Tonight on Greater Boston from the Boston Public Library, some serious questions about the police response to a group of white supremacists who marched through Boston over the weekend, with many asking whether the city is doing enough to stop hate and protect vulnerable groups. U.S. Attorney for Massachusetts Rachael Rollins joins me. Then later, as our attention is directed elsewhere, is Russia methodically destroying Ukraine? Is the U.S. doing enough to help? Do Americans even care? International affairs experts Tom Nichols and Carol Saivetz join me. Less than 2 months after a gunman slaughtered 19 elementary school kids and 2 teachers in Uvalde, Texas, and another man massacred 10 black shoppers at a Buffalo, New York supermarket, having targeted people based on the color of their skin, yet another masked gunman shot and killed at least 7 people at a 4th of July parade in Highland Park, Illinois yesterday. Police said the shooter targeted spectators with a high-powered rifle from a rooftop. And for hours after, the city was in lockdown as police searched for 22-year-old Robert Crimo, who ultimately led officers on a brief car chase before he was taken in, quote, without incident. As many have noted, his treatment was quite different from that of Jaylen Walker, a black man who was shot and killed by police a week before in Akron, Ohio. Body cam footage, which we're only showing part of, shows officers firing at least 60 shots at 25-year-old Walker, who was running away from officers after a car chase that started as a traffic stop. Demonstrators have since taken to the streets in Akron and elsewhere to protest Walker's death and racism in policing. Meanwhile, here in Boston, there are a lot of questions about how police did or did not deal with a white supremacist group that marched through the city over the weekend. At one point, images from a Boston Herald photographer appear to show members of the group Patriot Front tackling a black man, who said several of them surrounded him with shields and knocked him to the ground. And we later learned that while police say they tracked the march via surveillance cameras, it's unclear what kind of police presence they had on the ground during the march. But safe to say, it looked very different than what we saw during some of the Boston Black Lives Matter protests back in 2020, a divergence that officials said today they are looking into. I'm joined by one of those officials, U.S. Attorney for Massachusetts, former Suffolk County DA Rachael Rollins. U.S. Attorney, it's good to see you. Thanks for being here.
Always a pleasure.
Can we start with a little context for a second? For people who feel the presence of white supremacists on our streets is aberrational, it is not. There were the neo-Nazis at the St. Patrick's Day parade in Southie, where they're saying, keep Boston Irish. There were the neo-Nazi protesters at Brigham and Women's protesting against doctors campaigning for health care equity, saying they're killing white people. So this, as I say, is not an aberration.
That's correct, Jim. We saw, as you said, Brigham and Women back in January of 2022. We saw March 11th, St. Patrick's Day, the incident happening there. And then this weekend, we had certain incidents that, of course, were NSC 131, as opposed to the Patriot Front that we saw here. But this is not new to Boston, sadly.
What does that say to you? What does that say?
It's troubling that they're becoming more emboldened, that these are not small groups of individuals any longer. We had over 100 people marching through the streets. They're also organized, quite frankly, and they are not as overt maybe as some other groups that might say, for example, on Facebook, we are, there's going to be 1,000 of us meeting to march to the State House regarding the following. These individuals aren't engaging in that type of overt behavior right now. And so there are times where they are not known to law enforcement until they actually arrive. And then, Jim, we have to be honest, there is a real tension between certain communities. And this is what we talked about today, the mayor and myself and other law enforcement partners, where there are certain communities that feel like they are surveilled and watched constantly. And then other communities, you know, even though these individuals might not be from here per se, but that have the freedom to show up and march without any sort of questioning or altercation.
Well, can I put words in your mouth and tell me if they don't belong there? Certain communities mean, in the first case, communities of color, and in the second, you meant communities or marches that are involving white people. Is that what you were saying?
Well, today I can give you a real example. There were individuals that said, you know, there was somebody from the trans community in the meeting that we had with with stakeholders today that said, look, we had a march, and there were a small number of us, and 4 police cars showed up and put lights on when we had our march for our rights. There was no, these are their words, not mine. They believe there was no police involvement with respect to this Patriot Front when they were able to march freely down the street and then even engage in an altercation. And to your point, Jim, like setting the table of all of this is sadly the Jalen Walker situation where there's over 90 shots, 60 enter his body and exit potentially. Traffic violation, he was unarmed and allegedly wearing a ski mask, whereas Robert Crimo, who we know had killed 6 people and harmed at least 30 others, was led the police on a police chase and lived to see another day. No one is in any way implying that we wanted Robert Crimo killed, but there is a real concern in certain communities that we want law enforcement writ large to show the same discretion and de-escalation they show overwhelmingly to certain communities when they engage in murderous acts to others when they have committed no murder themselves.
I want to talk about, get back to non-murderous acts for a minute. You seem to be saying, I'm sorry to press this, that communities of color, communities of vulnerable people, in the case of the trans demonstrators you mentioned a minute ago, are treated differently by law enforcement in this community than white demonstrators like the Patriot Front. That is what you're saying, is it not?
Well, what I'm saying is there were people speaking in the meeting that made that very clear that that is what they believe. I need to be explicit about the following. I don't know whether that trans meeting that happened had been put out on social media. I don't know enough about that incident to speak eloquently about it, but I do know that this organization itself, Patriot Front, NSC 131, they are actively working to be covert so that they will not be infiltrated, they will not be stopped by law enforcement. We saw in Idaho, though, that there were arrests that were made, and some of those individuals are here in Boston as well.
So let's hear from Greg Long, who's the acting superintendent in chief. He was asked today whether they viewed the assault on Charles, I believe it's Murrell is how his last name is pronounced, a black man at the corners of Dartmouth and Stewart. And here's what Long had to say. What
I will say is, my understanding is in Boston, they did not witness it. In terms of the investigation, obviously there's a lot of video that's been recovered. And again, I mentioned it inside this meeting. There's a lot of detectives assigned to that in an effort to identify those individuals involved in this assault. If we're able to make identifications, people's faces are visible. We have mechanisms, to try to identify those people, whether they're out of state or they're local people. There will be charges brought. I have to say, I don't understand that. Is he saying that the police were not a physical presence and that video surveillance is all there was? What was he saying, U.S. Attorney?
I think, Jim, what that was in response to was a question regarding why weren't arrests made right then? If we know that Mr. Morrell was attacked or harmed or, had cuts and bruises to his face or finger or hand, why weren't arrests made? And what I think Commissioner Long was saying was none of that happened in the presence of law enforcement.
Where were they?
In the meeting out.
Where were they?
That's a good question. I don't know whether that it happened when they weren't physically there yet or not. But what I am doing, Jim, is being briefed by not only the FBI, the transit police, the Boston police, and others about what is the video that we can put together to see whether we can do this. We saw, Jim, in Idaho, that there was riot gear worn, that there was smoke grenades, shin guards, and shields. We had shields here. We had face coverings up to, right below our eyes. We had glasses or sunglasses, and there may be some issues with respect to identification. And we have to make sure that we are honest about that. But also there are times I'm told that maybe the face mask fell down and we may be able to identify some of those people.
Yeah, but the issue is not, to me, the issue is not Idaho, with all due respect. The issue is you just saw the photograph from the Boston Globe when there were Black Lives Matter demonstrations here. The police were there in great force. And using some of it, I should say, as compared to, it appears and maybe I'll be proven wrong, a non-in-person presence here. You said today that you are thinking strategically about how to combat this so people in this community can feel safe. What does that mean, U.S. Attorney?
What it means is, and we were asked real pointed questions about this today, does Boston, does the Commonwealth have a strategic plan, an affirmative plan regarding the rise in racially motivated violent extremism, right?
And what's
we have
the
heard
answer?
From the
What answer did you get?
And the answer is we, quite frankly, I believe there are people that would say we do. We need to be transparent about, is that written down? Have we done trainings with respect to each other? Not just the FBI knowing what their policy is. I don't want a reactive law enforcement, Jim. I want a proactive law enforcement. We are seeing as well, Jim, now certain communities have events coming up in the near future where should the Black community now also have the added burden of having to pay for security for their events because they're fearful that individuals like this may show up if there's an event in the community, for example, or something else like that. So we need to make sure we are convening. I will be calling together all of our law enforcement partners to see what is the answer to that question. Is there a written document? Okay. And if so, I want to review that.
You know, last time when you were here, we had a similar discussion to what you said a few minutes ago about the disparate treatment of whites, for example, in Buffalo after a mass murder, as compared to how some people of color who've done virtually nothing wrong are treated. And you said police often can see themselves in these individuals. Is that what you think happened here in Boston over the weekend with the Patriot Front?
I don't know. I don't want to speculate regarding what happened here, but I will say that there were pointed questions to law enforcement, of which I am a member, as to the reaction with respect to Black Lives Matter after our entire nation witnessed the execution of George Floyd, people going out into the streets. And yes, a small fraction of those individuals or faction of those individuals ended up committing larcenies or breaking in or harming property. But ultimately, there was a much more concerted police response to those marches than there were to these. There were also, Jim, thousands and thousands more people at the Black Lives Matter event than there were at this. But what we need to do is be comfortable enough to go back and look and see, are there things we could have done differently? And we is me included, law enforcement, right? Was the police response appropriate? And if not, how are we going to make sure the next time that they show up, we are ready for them? And if there's any engagement of crimes that they do, whether it's threats or whether it's trespassing or whether it's any of these other things, I'm not the DA anymore. Remember, those things are prosecuted now. I look at it and say, what are we going to do? How are we going to react? And we need to make sure communities feel safe, all communities, because it happened to be a Black man or somebody who identifies in the LGBTQ community, but that very well, Jim, could have been a member of the Jewish community, an otherly abled person, a member of the AAPI community. It is, this ideology is a belief that only they are apex predators, or only they are the victims of the great replacement, and the rest of the people that are just here trying to live and be comfortable are somehow a threat to them. And we know that's not true.
Rachael Rollins, thanks for your time as always. Appreciate it.
You got it.
Next up, NATO is a step closer to getting two nations larger today, with Finland and Sweden signing official papers aimed at making them the 31st and 32nd members of the organization.
We share the same values and we face the same challenges in the Baltic Sea and beyond. Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine has shattered peace in Europe. So it is important we all stand together at this dangerous moment in our history.
Of note, Finland shares an 840-mile land border. Sweden shares a maritime border with Russia, which is well into month 5 of its invasion of Ukraine. At this point, Russia is aiming its main offensive at the eastern Donbas region after declaring victory in Luhansk province over the weekend. And while Biden has promised to continue supporting Ukraine, as he recently acknowledged, there's still a lot of uncertainty and a lot of Americans who are far more worried about their wallet than what happens in Europe.
We are going to support Ukraine as long as it takes. Inflation is higher in almost every other country. Prices at the pump are higher in almost every other country. We're better positioned to deal with this than anyone, but we have a way to go. I don't know how it's going to end, but it will not end with a Russian defeat of Ukraine in Ukraine.
I'm joined by Carol Saivetz, Senior Advisor for MIT's Security Studies Program and a Research Associate at Harvard's Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies and the Harvard Ukrainian Institute, and Tom Nichols, an international affairs expert, a regular contributor to The Atlantic, and author of its Peacefield newsletter. Carol and Tom, good to see you again.
Nice to see you.
So, Carol, starting with you, following up on Russian successes in eastern Ukraine, as a layperson, I feel like I'm watching the slow motion slaughter of the Ukrainian fighters. Am I overreacting?
I don't think you're overreacting, Jim, but I think that we need to put it into some kind of perspective. I think that the victory in Luhansk is a symbolic victory, and I think that the fight for Donetsk is going to be long and drawn out still. The Ukrainians still hold Kramatorsk and Slovyansk, and these are two major holdouts on the Ukrainian side. The problem, I think, and what you're reacting to and what we're all reacting to viscerally is that we see the pictures of just these massive bombardments, artillery shells, indiscriminate bombing of civilian areas, and the Russians have proven that they can hit just about any place in Ukraine arbitrarily, just to sort of prove that they can do it without any military value.
And Tom, what the Ukrainian leaders are saying is if they had more modern weaponry, they could counter much of that offensive. Do they have a point?
Sure. And they're getting a lot of weaponry, and they are countering a lot of this offensive. Remember, there's kind of a rough rule of thumb in military affairs that you need something like 3 to 1 to conduct an offensive against somebody who's dug in and defending. And the Ukrainians are losing a lot of people. They're the smaller force here, but the Russians are basically sending men and materials into a meat grinder. They're just chewing up their own forces and losing a lot of their own equipment because they don't care, because they have plenty of it to waste. And so the losses, to echo Carol's point, part of what we're reacting to is that the Ukrainian losses are dearer to the Ukrainians because they are smaller and because they care more about their people. But the Russians are just throwing people into this because they can, and that's going to make this drag on for quite a long time. But with more advanced weapons, it means that the Russians are basically having to up the ante and use numbers to overcome that weaponry.
Tom, staying with you for a minute, I mentioned Finland and Sweden and the process moving along. How big a deal is that in real terms? I understand it further isolates Russia, but what's the practical consequence of that? Any?
Oh, it's huge.
How so?
These are two of the most militarily capable states in Northern Europe. And the idea, I think, when Carol and I first started studying what we would have called Soviet affairs, you would never have thought that the balance of power in Europe would be so disrupted by what the Russians are doing, that Finland and Sweden would become the 31st and 32nd members of NATO. I mean, this really, from here and for the foreseeable future, puts and keeps Russia in the status of an inferior conventional power, which means that all they can do is brutalize the people on their own borders and threaten nuclear retaliation if anybody tries to get in their way to do that. But NATO's never been this powerful in its history.
Can I jump in for a sec? I mean, I think we have to remember that Finland and Sweden are already sort of NATO compatible military forces. They've been cooperating with NATO for years, so there's not a long process to get them up to speed to join NATO ranks. I mean, they're there.
So that's the good news, according to you both. The bad news, at least from my perspective, I don't know if you saw this poll. Admittedly, it's a month plus old, but I would argue the numbers would be more troubling, not less troubling. This is a poll from YouGov and Data Praxis. 8,100 adults in 10 European countries. What is most important in the Ukraine-Russian war? Stop the war as soon as possible, 35%. Punish Russia, 22%. 43% have no opinion, neither of these, that sort of thing. that tied with the fact that in the United States here, while still relatively small, I think there were 57 Republicans in the House who voted against the $40 billion from the U.S. in May, and I think there were 11 Senate Republicans. Those numbers seem to be growing too, despite the assurances, Tom, from President Biden the other day, the sort of the old as long as it takes kind of thing. Are the people of those countries and this country bought into the as long as it takes thing?
Well, first, Jim, I'm going to take issue with the wording in that poll. There is something in between stop everything right now or punish Russia. I mean, if you ask me, do I want to stop the fighting as soon as possible? Of course I do, but not at any cost to Ukraine, which is the unspoken next part of that sentence. And you know, that the other option here isn't punishing Russia. It's helping Ukraine to defend itself for as long as it needs to. I think Americans...
That's
what I was going to say. America. Sorry, go ahead, Jim.
Accepting that criticism of the poll, what's your assessment of how strong and solid the support of the people in all these countries, including ours, is of continued relentless support at great financial cost of Ukraine?
Well, and I was going to say the American public is far more supportive of this than the Republican Party, which is really, you know, a shocking reversal for the party of Reagan from the 80s. Mm-hmm. And so I think that as with most things in foreign policy, the president and the leaders of NATO have a lot of latitude to deal with this, as long as people don't think that dealing with this war in Ukraine is somehow directly injuring them or affecting them in some way. I mean, I think people always prioritize domestic politics over foreign policy, which I think is a mistake. But I actually think that the leaders of NATO have a lot more room on this than it seems.
Well, you know, except Carol, I would say to that at least the leaders are suggesting to their people that this is affecting them. Joe Biden continues to refer to it as Putin's inflation. Leaders of France, Germany, other countries are talking about how energy costs are going up in great part because of what's happening in Ukraine. So is that softening popular support or is it not?
Well, I think Biden is trying to brand what's happening to like gasoline prices in this country as directly a result of the war in Ukraine.
Of course he is.
I mean, so that's part of the.
But the American people are hearing
they're
hearing from their president. One of the reasons you're paying $5 a gallon is because of this war, whether it happens to be as true as Joe Biden would like us to believe it is or not. No.
Well, I think one of the problems is that Putin is counting on precisely what you're hinting at, that as he cuts off gas supplies, natural gas supplies to Germany, cuts the electricity grid to Finland, et cetera, he's banking on sort of there being a populist kind of uprising saying, we don't want to deal with this isn't our fight. But so far, those numbers that, whether or not you agree with the way the question was asked, those numbers don't say that this vast majority of people are against the war. They're just beginning to question it. And I think that it's up to the leaders to sell the war to their populations at home. And it's probably accelerating the shift away from Russian natural gas and oil.
Can we add one more point about the which is that if Biden said tomorrow, look, we're out of this, we're done, Ukraine can, can fall, we don't care. The Russians wouldn't stop this war. This war would go on. And then the next poll would say, why isn't Joe Biden doing enough to keep gas prices down while, Russia is rolling across Europe? Because that it would still, oil prices would still be high. The war would still go on. I mean, to some extent, these are no-win scenarios for every NATO leader, because no matter what you do, what the public really wants is for there to be peace in Europe and stable energy prices. And Putin's not going to allow that.
Yeah, well, what's rationality got to do with politics? Before you go, I was stunned when you were both here last month and you both answered the question the same when I asked you, how is this war, what has to happen for this war to end? And Tom, I think you were the first one to answer and said, Putin's got to be gone. And I asked you, do you mean that exactly as you say it? And you said yes. Could you elaborate on that just for a second, Tom, and then Carol?
I just don't think Vladimir Putin's ever going to climb down out of this tree he's put himself in. He believed that this war could succeed. He's not taking no for an answer. He is going to punish the Ukrainians for humiliating him and taking as much territory as he can. Even if Zelensky said tomorrow, I want to negotiate, I want to end this war, we would find ourselves going through what we went through in 2014 until today, which is that Putin would say, okay, we'll negotiate. And meanwhile, there would be conflict every day along the line of contact between the Russians and the Ukrainians.
Carol,
until
that's
Putin's
and
gone, this is going to go on.
You agree, even if it turns out Zelensky all of a sudden said, take eastern Ukraine, you still subscribe to Tom's thesis?
I think the fear would be that even if there were a ceasefire declared and there was some kind of line of demarcation or ceasefire between, say, Luhansk and Donetsk and the rest of Ukraine, that Putin would prosecute the war by other means. We saw that, as Tom said, between 2014 and today. There were people being killed every night along the line of demarcation. There were snipers and everything else. And I think he would only use the ceasefire to regroup. The irony to me of the whole thing is that everything Putin said that he wanted has backfired. He now has Sweden and Finland in NATO. He has Ukrainian resolve. He has U.S. support. He has sanctions such as he's never seen before, which are definitely hurting the Russian economy. And he expected none of that.
Carol Saivetz, Tom Nichols, as always, thanks for your thoughts. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
That's it for tonight. Please come back tomorrow. Another NFL Super Bowl champion and the first Major League Soccer player have been diagnosed with a traumatic brain disease known as CTE. Concussion Legacy Foundation co-founder Chris Nowinski and former MLS MVP Taylor Twellman join me on that. Plus, two local filmmakers who, after meeting in a most unexpected place, jail, brought the story of Boston's busing crisis to the big screen in The Walk. That and more tomorrow at 7. Thank you for watching. And please remember Ukraine, as the Boston Pops did last night in this moving Independence Day tribute to the nation featuring the Ukrainian national anthem.